Brock, President of Strategic Economic Decisions. My research organization for 20-some years has been dedicated to taking big topics and going deep. One of my prejudices is I'm not going to do that unless I can utilize the best theory possible to guide me. In a world like today, when everything is topsy-turvy and the old rules of thumb don't work, the idea that you can statisticize the past and extrapolate into the future as if the future were like the past is a dead end, and I think most people now recognize that. You've got to think theoretically, deductively, and deeply to deal with some of the difficult problems we have, because we haven't had these problems before. One of them is the performance of the US economy right now. And what I'm going to talk about in this brief talk is what do you do to fix it? Can it be fixed? Now, the first thing to notice is that only 11% of Americans think that their government is doing a good job. Now, if you went back 5,000 years, really only 400 years, the job of government until very recently was to keep the peace and prevent you from getting attacked by the guys next door. This is because productivity growth was essentially zero. Now, productivity growth is wealth growth if you properly understand economic theory. So essentially the only way a king could make his people happy and make them love him by making them richer was to go seize the land of the guy next door and the gold and the slaves and the wines and whatever else. But you knew that the king next door was thinking the same thing, so you were in this constant state of war, and the growth of wealth essentially was a zero-sum land grab. This is not true today. Starting at the time of the Dutch Republic, the Protestant ethic, the introduction of patent law, etc., we found in the last 200 or 300 years you can get rich by two new ways. First, productivity growth, new patents, new theories, new products. Whereas living standards and productivity growth is not known to have even doubled in any 1,000-year period before 1700. Living standards have risen approximately 29-fold since 1700. It takes 1/29th of your annual labor to earn today the standard of living of your forebear in 1700. This is remarkable. You also developed trade. Trade is not about productivity. Trade is that we both benefit. If you're good at selling maple syrup in your country and I'm good at making computer chips, we both have a comparative advantage. We trade, and the fundamental theorems of trade show that with appropriate side payments, every nation comes out ahead from free trade. So because of this, you don't need land grabs anymore. China went from being nothing to the second biggest economy on earth without seizing an acre. And what do we want? Do we want to go take Chechnya and have terrorists attack us for the next 40 years in revenge? Nobody's grabbing land. It's a pain in the butt. We get rich through productivity growth, exports, etc. Now, because of this, people think their governments are doing a bad job today, not because they don't have great aircraft carriers. People don't even care about that. They can't get jobs. Today, what matters is we don't live in villages and feed ourselves. And remember, for 5,000 years, there were no business cycles. There were crop failures now and then, but there was no industrial economy. Now we have jobs in an industrial and a post-industrial economy, and government is not going to be popular if we can't get jobs, much less jobs that pay decently. What do we do to fix the mess that we're in now? This is what I want to talk about. But you're not going to get very far unless you make clear what you really do want. Mr. President, here's what I think you and I both want. Number one, we want jobs, jobs, jobs. Number two, of course, we want GDP growth to be stronger. Number three, it would be nice to have productivity growth even stronger because that's the source of wealth growth. And number four, we want to make sure that unlike Italy, Greece, Spain, and other countries, we don't irritate and upset the bond market. Bond markets are pulling in the welcome mat and saying, we're not going to fund you debt crazy people anymore unless you cut your deficit way down. We've got to please the bond markets, create jobs, have a strong recovery, raise productivity. That's a wish list. The question is, can you do it? Now, were I putting this in the form of mathematical economics, the conclusion I'm going to arrive at that yes, there is one and only one solution that achieves all four of those goals. This can be shown to be a theorem deducible from axioms and premises, but I'm not going to do that in this talk. But that's sort of what's going on here. All right, so I'm going to have a sort of hypothetical discussion with the president. Now, Mr. Brock, thank you very much for meeting with me. The advice I'm getting is, we've tried so hard with very low interest rates and 10% of GDP government deficits for over 4 years. I mean, what I've done, what we've done, no one can say we didn't try to get the show back on the road, but unfortunately we still have 23 million Americans out of work. This is really bad. Well, Mr. President, remember, you did try, but the headwinds confronting the economy this time were much, much greater than before. State and local governments like the Brock family had over-binged and over-borrowed, and rather than hiring the usual 500,000 workers during a business cycle that they used to, they fired 700,000. Then you turn to housing. Prices are up a little bit now, but the housing industry never came back, so construction jobs never came back. They will, slowly, but not yet, unfortunately. It was such a bad disaster what happened. There are no big investment opportunities, like for Clinton, Mark Andreessen invented the browser. And with the browser invented in late 1994, we then for 5 years had a huge capital spending boom rewiring America and inserting fiber optical systems throughout the entire nation. It was a boom. We don't have any such innovation right now, other than, say, Facebook or something. So there were a lot of headwinds. It's even worse than that, but I think you know this all too well. Now, Mr. Brock, can I interrupt? It is so bad, that's why I sanctioned these huge government deficits we've been running. But it doesn't seem to have worked. What went wrong? What's different this time? You're saying conditions were worse. Well, fine. We responded with a much bigger than usual fiscal and monetary push. Given an unprecedentedly large fiscal and monetary push, God knows we tried, we still are having trouble getting off of dead center. What's the solution here? I can't go spend more money because the bond markets are going to come after me the way they did Italy and Greece. Our interest rates are going to be driven up, and, well, you can't upset the bond market these days. What do? I'm between a rock and a hard place. Mr. President, what you got to do is rethink things from scratch. Using advanced macroeconomic theory associated with several Nobel Prize winners, let me in simple English explain what you might do. The first thing you do is you take a leaf from the philosophy of science and realize that sometimes the words we use misserve us. In physics, it was assumed there was an ether through which electromagnetic forces propagated to create what we call light. All the best physicists assumed that the ether was out there in space. We just couldn't agree on what the heck it really was. Then in 1905, Einstein showed there never was an ether at all, and bang, electromagnetic theory took off fantastically, culminating in quantum physics, a couple of decades later. In your case, Mr. President, the word deficit, that is a very important word. If you go to Australia, where I just was visiting, if a prime minister runs a deficit, it's grounds for dismissal. Deficits are bad. We've overborrowed. We're on the route to bankruptcy. Cut thy deficit. We all agree with that. The problem is, the word has no meaning. There are only good deficits that the bond market likes, and bad deficits that the bond market doesn't like. Let me give you a hypothetical example. I'm going to call this America yesterday versus America tomorrow. America yesterday, let's say the government spends $4 trillion a year. It's more than that, but let's say they spend $4 trillion. Tax receipts are $3 trillion. 3 from 4 is 1. We need to borrow $1 trillion every year to come up with the money for the Treasury to pay its bills. Fair enough? So, unfortunately, all the money we spend is spent unproductively. The $4 trillion are spent unproductively. That's not to say you don't need to spend it. You do need to pay the interest in the debt, write Social Security checks, keep the defense armed and ready. But you don't create new profit streams and new jobs with this kind of spending. You keep government workers at work, you give emergency tax cuts to consumers. It's fine, but it doesn't create any new jobs. The job multiplier, so to speak, is zero. The bond market sees this and says, you're basically borrowing yet another $1 trillion and putting it on the shoulders of the kids. These kids, one generation ago, brought down 2 presidents with 5 famous words. Hell no, we won't go to Vietnam. The bond markets are saying, the grandchildren of these kids are going to one day say, hell no, we won't pay. Ooh, this is a default risk. Mr. President, the welcome mat is being withdrawn. If you run another $1 trillion deficit, we're going to charge you more, and that's going to make the nation even worse off. This is called the bond market risk premium. 4 percentage points, if you will, in Italy, more in Greece. I don't know the exact numbers right now, and they keep changing. So, long story short, country B, its government, now I hope this is America tomorrow, spends $4 trillion. The tax receipts are $3 trillion, so it's running a $1 trillion deficit, but no, it isn't. That's because country B, in spending $4 trillion, spends only $3 trillion of it unproductively. But then it borrows $1 trillion for what I've proposed as a Marshall Plan for fixing the investments in the infrastructure of the United States economy. Now let me talk about this, because this is very, very interesting. The bond market asks, okay, you're borrowing still $1 trillion, but this is good. This time you're actually investing it. Maybe that'll lead to an interstate highway system, which really improved everything. And the point here is, using the theories of Kenneth Arrow, a Nobel laureate economist, you don't want to simply invest in infrastructure and build roads to nowhere. You want to make sure that the projects you invest in are profitable. We need a new investment bank using the theory of public finance, not private, that says out of, say, 21 bullet train proposals, which 9 are worth building because they have a positive rate of return on capital. The interstate highway system was a huge project. We believe it had about an 11% rate of return on capital. Boy, that's a winner. That's new jobs, that's new profits. Borrowing of this kind, spent in that manner, pleases the bond market, because the act of investing productively raises productivity growth, which raises growth of the economy, which reduces the debt load on the children who won't say, hell no, we won't pay. So the bond market likes it when you have a, quote, good deficit. A good deficit being you borrow $1 trillion and that money gets spent productively. Now you're going to ask, Mr. Brock, can I interrupt? Do we really need $1 trillion a year for infrastructure? Mr. President, the OECD has ranked Britain and the US at the bottom of the list in infrastructure. We haven't put a new roof in the house in 45 years. We have had negative net public investment. I want 10 different forms of infrastructure investment. You talk about potholes and roads, Mr. President, get real. We need the electric grid, fracking infrastructure, natural gas infrastructure, new medical systems, educational, airport reforms. We have a whole slew of things. And Mr. President, the good news is the rate of return from investing in this manner is exponentially increasing with how long it's been since you last put a new roof on. Switzerland today, where roofs are always perfect and new and don't need repairing, could not do what I'm talking about. They would effectively be building roads to nowhere because they already have wonderful roads. We are the ones that need the infrastructure. Need, when your infrastructure is going critical, which it is for us in this decade, means high rate of return on fixing it. So, in addition, Mr. President, you can now fund this with negative real interest rates. They're the lowest in history. This is a bargain. Well, now, Mr. Brock, this is very, very interesting. I guess you're right, we really do need this, and we sure have a lot of unemployed people to help out, but I'm sitting here worrying about jobs, jobs, jobs. That's what might get me voted out of office. You haven't really talked about jobs. Could you say something about this? Now, Mr. President, I'm very glad you brought that up. You see, you probably believe the standard story, which is right but sloppy, that the bigger the deficit, the more the stimulus. The more the stimulus, the faster the growth of the economy and the greater the number of jobs. Well, yes, Mr. Brock, that's the idea, but the bond market won't let me borrow. Oh, it will if you run good deficits. But let's stick to your question and focus here on jobs. I want you to go back to country A. When you borrow and spend it by giving tax cuts or keeping state and local workers on their jobs through federal to state income transfers, which is what we've been doing, that's good. You keep people in their jobs, but you don't create one new job. None is created. So that big $1 trillion stimulus helps in some ways, but it doesn't seem to help in creating jobs. Now, country B, in the second case, there the $1 trillion that it borrows is going to be spent. Bechtel Corporation will competitively bid to deal with highways and infrastructure of that kind. Somebody else will for the national energy grid, somebody else will for this, for that, whatever. Let's say there's 10 different types of infrastructure, and each of the people who've competitively bid to work on this get on January 2nd a check for $100 billion. They get the check. What do they do, Mr. President, with the money? Well, I guess they put it in the bank, Mr. President. Indeed, they do. And they've got to get going because they're under a competitive bid. They got to start building that stuff tomorrow. The bank keeps about 9% of the money aside for a rainy day, but then says you can go and leverage up the $91 billion you have. You can use letters of credit. It can effectively become about 150 to 200 billion of spendable money. And you got to go build that stuff. Mr. President, what do you do with that money? I'm drawing a bit of a blank, Mr. Brock. I'll tell you what you do, Mr. President. You hire 450 subcontractors. A lot of jobs. They in turn buy computers, trucks, pipes, any of the things you need. And they, in hiring these subcontractors, make it possible for a subcontractor 231 who gets 150 million. That subcontractor, in turn, will hire subcontractors and so forth and so on, and will be buying devices and putting up sheds, infrastructure, tunneling, doing whatever. Mr. President, this is Sir John Hicks's Nobel Prize. Other economists, Kaldor, Koletsky, etc. This is known as the accelerator multiplier theory of investment. Now, Mr. Brock, what you're saying is pretty amazing here. You're saying that you get a huge increase in jobs depending on how we spend the money. Yes, Mr. President, that's exactly the point. This is not a left-wing, right-wing view. This is a common sense 101 view. We need infrastructure. We have the resources. The cost of borrowing is the lowest in modern history. We should do this in particular because not only are we rebuilding and leaving our kids a better infrastructure, but because this is the way to really create jobs and jobs and jobs. And it builds upon itself, it feeds upon itself. So I think this is a win-win strategy. I think we should start it. You have to be a leader. You have to point out we're going to do this. We've had a Pearl Harbor. We're getting out of it. We're building. So that's just, I hope, a useful perspective. Remember what we've achieved by virtue of profitable infrastructure spending. You are raising productivity growth, which does not happen if you just build roads to nowhere. Higher productivity growth, Mr. President, remember, means faster growth by definition and a better future, and it relieves the debt on the shoulders of the children. Secondly, you raise GDP. Third, you hugely raise the job creation rate. And fourth, the bond market is happy. This is the way you fulfill all four of the goals I set forth at the beginning. And I hope you will endorse this. Thank you very much.